I'm Anthony F. Elmore, President and Founder of the Proud Black Buddhist World Association. We at the Proud Black Buddhist World Association practice the Buddhist teachings as taught by the 13th century Japanese Buddhist sage Nichiren Shonin. It is Nichiren that teaches us that it is the Lotus Sutra that is the highest of the Buddhist teachings. And Nichiren teaches us that we should only practice, the only sutra we should practice is the Lotus Sutra. Now, we are the Black Buddhist Voice in America, and we are unapologetically black. I live in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee is one of the most historic and unique cities in America. If you want to get an understanding of Buddhism, then we bring you a Black Buddhist perspective of Buddhism. In regards to the Buddhist religion, we are the Proud Black Buddhist World Association, and we introduce more Black Buddhist history and culture than any group or any individual in our world. We believe that our background gives us an unprecedented African American view into the Buddhist religion. There exists a world culture whereas you have people of European descent who believe that their skin color makes them inherently superior to people of color. That I present a Black Buddhist perspective. Now, to the white man and to white people who don't care about a Black Buddhist perspective, I say that Black lives matter and a Black Buddhist perspective matters. You see, in all of Buddhism, there is no Black Buddhist voice until we came on the scene. You see, because Buddhism, or in the Buddhist religion, there's a history and a culture where all Black Buddhist history, culture, and language has been extricated from Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism is the time in our history whereas Buddhism became separated by race, language, and culture. Mahayana Buddhism is characterized by the racist language of Sanskrit. Sanskrit is the language of the Brahmins. And in the language of the Brahmins, this teachings, or when something is in Sanskrit, it removes all Black culture, history, and language. The title of my lecture is The Black Buddhist Voice in America. Memphis was founded by one of the largest slave owners in American history. Memphis was founded by Andrew Jackson, who was a former president of the United States of America. Andrew Jackson is noted as the original person who did ethnic cleansing, that it was in Memphis, Tennessee, and it was as he who was the president of the United States cleansed all of the Native Americans. In fact, Andrew Jackson and his Democratic buddies passed a law called the Indian Removal Act, where all of the Native Americans who have lived on this land thousands of years before white people ever came, they were cleansed from the land, and they had to go and move on a plantation. In fact, people had to come all the way from the East Coast, all the way across the Mississippi River right here in Memphis, and they took those people to Oklahoma. This was called the infamous Trail of Tears, where they extricated all of the Native Americans from Memphis, Tennessee. later Memphis was set up as the slave capital of the world. Now, please understand that the historical process of writing black people out of world history began in the Buddhist religion. You see, please understand that the world's largest archaeological display of black history is in the Buddhist religion. See, when it comes to carvings and archaeological evidence of the Black Buddha, there is no person in the world who has more historical carvings than the world-honored one, the Buddha. You find Buddha carved in mountains, and the one identifying quality that you will see in the Buddhist carvings is that you will see the black hair on the Buddha. The Buddha is carved with black hair. Now, in the 1st century AD, whites pulled off the greatest rewrite in human history. The Black History Rewrite is a new form of Buddhism. It came in a new form of Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism. Now, I want you to look at the historic Gandhara images of the Buddha, whereas the Kushan King Kanishka changed the Buddha from black to white. See, it is in Mahayana Buddhism where the voice of the Buddha changed from black to white via a language called Sanskrit. You see, Sanskrit is a language that was invented by a Brahmin by the name of Panini. This was invented in the AD. You see, the earliest archaeological evidence of Sanskrit is the Rudra Dinam. See, the way the Brahmins used to write black people out of Buddhism was to rewrite Buddhism in Sanskrit, and the Sanskrit was the language of the Brahmins. You see, the Brahmins were Hindu, and they hated the Buddhists. You see, in the writings, there's no such thing in the ancient writings as what you call a Hindu. See, the Buddhist religion goes back to some of the earliest written history of mankind. The Buddhist religion goes back to the African countries of Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, and Abyssinia. Please note that Buddhism did not get to Asia until 1,000 years after the Buddha's death. Mahayana Buddhism came to spread to China, Korea, and Japan. Please understand that Nichiren Buddhism has not and is not Mahayana Buddhism. Nichiren Buddhism is based only on the Lotus Sutra, and Nichiren clearly rejected Mahayana Buddhism. It is Nichiren that teaches us that we should only follow the Lotus Sutra. Nichiren Shonin was clearly a Black Buddhist voice. Now, please understand that most of the Buddhism in Japan came from India. It moved to China, it moved to Korea, and later moved to Japan. Japan is known as a Mahayana Buddhist country. Now, in regards to the Lotus Sutra, it was the great Japanese sage that debated other sects and put the Lotus Sutra as supreme. Now, in the Gosho, the Gosho are letters that Nichiren Shonin wrote to his disciples. And Nichiren Shonin wrote a Gosho called The Bodies and Minds of Ordinary Beings. And it reads, quote, "In Japan, the supreme position of the Lotus Sutra was established by the great teacher Dingyo, the founder of the Japanese Tendai sect. However, during the same period, Kobo established the esoteric True World School, and Dingyo's successors eventually fell under its influence, placing the Lotus Sutra on the same level as the esoteric teachings. Thus, the teachings of the Lotus Sutra became obscure, unquote. Now, please be clear that it was Shakyamuni Buddha who rejected both Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhism and led his followers to the Lotus Sutra. Now, in the Ghost Show, it's called Embracing the Lotus Sutra. It reads, quote, again, in the second volume it says, I am the only person who can rescue and protect others. And it speaks of desiring only to accept and embrace the sutra of the great vehicle and not accepting a single verse of other sutras. These passages mean that only Shakyamuni Buddha can save and protect all living beings, and that one should wish to accept and uphold only the Lotus Sutra and never even a verse from any other sutra, unquote. Now, in the Ghost Show, it's called the Daimoku of the Lotus Sutra, and it reads, quote, it was only when he reached the age of 72 that he first began to intone Myoho Renge Kyo, the Daimoku of the Sutra. However, the people in faraway countries such as China and Japan were unable to hear of it at that time. It was over 1,000 years before China heard so much as the name of the sutra, and another 350 or more years before it was heard in Japan. You see, ladies and gentlemen, it is important to understand that it was Shakyamuni Buddha who first intoned Myoho Renge Kyo, the title of the Lotus Sutra. It was the Gohanzan in the Lotus Sutra was started not by Nichiren Shonin, but it was started by Shakyamuni Buddha. Now, when we learned from Nichiren Shonin that it was 1,000 years before the Lotus Sutra got to China, and it was 1,400 years after the death of the Buddha that it got to Japan. Now, in the Ghost Show, it's called The Sacred Teachings of the Buddha's Lifetime. And it reads, quote, with regard to the word Kyo, profound meaning says, quote, the voice carries out the work of the Buddha, and this is called Kyo or Sutra. You see, we chant Nam Mu Myoho Renge Kyo, and Kyo is the voice of the Buddha. Someone has to be the voice of the Buddha, or someone has to spread the teachings or spread Kyo. Now, it is very, very, very important to understand the Ghost Show. The sacred teachings of the Buddha's lifetime reads, the voice carries out the work of the Buddha, and it's called Kyo a Sutra. Please understand that in regards to black people worldwide, we practice the Buddhist faith. Black people do not have a voice in the Buddhist religion. Do not take my word for it. I want you to Google the word Black Buddhist Voice. What you will find is that it is Anthony Elmore who is the Black Buddhist voice in the world. Please understand that it is the Buddha who teaches us that the voice carries out the work of the Buddha. It also reads that the voice is called Kyo or Sutra. Now, let me give you an absolute history and fact. There does not exist in this world a Japanese, an Asian, or any white man or white people who can talk to black people better than black people can talk to black people. The question that you must ask is where and who is your Black Buddhist voice? Let me break this thing down and get real. The Buddha was born in Magadha. Magadha in ancient India come from the Harappan civilization, and the Harappan civilization were black people. Now, a man by the name of Sisu Naga founded the Magadha Empire. And later we read about Bimbisara, who was a contemporary of Shakyamuni Buddha. Ladies and gentlemen, we have archaeological, anthropological, genetic history, literary science to show that the Buddha was a black man. Just look at any statue of the Buddha and you see that black hair on the Buddha. Now, Daisaki Keita, in his book called The Living Buddha, he writes that the Buddha comes from an Indo-Aryan cultural spirit. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that at the time of the Buddha, there was no Indo-Aryans in India. There is no archaeological, anthropological, genetic science, literary science to tell you, that tells you or verifies that there were any white people in India at the time. Daisaki Keita's book, The Living Buddha, it is an interpretive, fictional book about the Buddha. But yet Daisaki Keita uses his prestige to spread a lie. We can go even 150 years after the death of the Buddha and the time of the father of history. That's Herodotus, who wrote, there were two Ethiopians, one east of the Red Sea and one west of the Red Sea. The word India means black. Please understand, we can go 150 years before the time of the Buddha and the time of Homer. In the time of Homer, India was known as Eastern Ethiopia. Please understand that SGI Buddhist leader Daisaki Keita is not a friend to black people. And he is a great liar. Daisaki Keita used his influence to perpetrate a fraud. In his fictional book, The Living Buddha, 300 years after the death of the Buddha, we have literary writings that talk about the black people of India. Now, I want to introduce you to one of the greatest writers. He was an ambassador for Chandragupta Maurya. You see, India started at the time of Alexander the Great. He tried to conquer India, and he ran up against these black people who had 80,000 elephants. They were called the Nandas. Now, after Alexander backed up, years later, Chandragupta Maurya conquered the Nandas. Now, under Chandragupta Maurya, he had a grandson who was very famous in Buddhism, and his name was called Asoka the Great. And he left writings, not in no Sanskrit, but he left writings in the Pali language. He left edifice and writings. You would see it at the Aphrodite Temple in Naga, Sudan. The Nubians were Buddhists. It was Herodotus who says that Muro was the cradle of the Gymnosophists. They were not called Buddhists, they were called Gymnosophists. Now, one of the things I want you to look up, Look up the name Megadethnes. Now, Megadethnes, he lived 350 to 290 BC. He was a Greek ethnographer and explorer in the Hellenistic period and an author of the work called the Indica. He became an ambassador of Seleucus I, Nikator of the Seleucid dynasty, to Chandragupta Maurya in India. Now, you must understand, ladies and gentlemen, that we can go back to 185 BC. You see, from the time of the Buddha's death and to 185 BC, there was a general, his name was Pushyamitra. Now, look up the name Pushyamitra. Nichiren Shonin talks about Pushyamitra. You see, the Mauryan general was at a parade, and Pushyamitra was a general, and he killed the Mauryan king in broad daylight, and he took over India and he became the king. He put a bounty on all of the Buddhists, and they started a Buddhist cult, a Brahmin cult rather. They had a Brahmin cult that ran all the Buddhists. The Buddhists had to go to Miro or to Nubia. They had to leave India. Buddhism left India, and Pushyamitra controlled all of India. Now, we move to 150 or at least 100 years into the AD, and we meet King Kanishka. Now, King Kanishka is important in history because under this white king, Kanishka, they rewrote Buddhist history by changing the Buddha from black to white. Look at the Gandhara images of the Buddha. Under King Kanishka, they created a new Buddhism that was separated by race, culture, and language. A man who was a former Brahmin. His name was Ashvaghosha. Ashvaghosha and King Kanishka got together and they created a new Buddhism that was separated by race, language, and culture. This new Buddhism was called Mahayana Buddhism. And Mahayana Buddhism was characterized by the new language of Sanskrit. Sanskrit was a language that was created by a Brahmin by the name of Panani. Now, the earliest archaeological records of Sanskrit is called the Rudra Dinam. There is no Sanskrit during the time of the Buddha. Sanskrit came up in the Shaka era. This Brahmin by the name of Panini created a new language from the Pali language, or from the black language, called Sanskrit. As we tell you, the earliest record, archaeological record of Sanskrit is the Rudra Dinam. You see, there was no Sanskrit. Now, the reason King Kanishka is very important is because this white king rewrote history. Now, the original of the Fourth Buddhist Council took place in Ceylon, which is now called Sri Lanka, in 29 BC. Now, just about 200 years later, when the white king Kanishka took over Buddhism, he and a former Brahmin by the name of Ashvaghosha created what we now know as Mahayana Buddhism. And creating Mahayana Buddhism, they separated Buddhism by race, culture, and language. Panini invented what is called the Sanskrit language. Now, King Kanishka and Ashvaghosha carried on, or they put together what was called their own Fourth Buddhist Council. They got together with their group of people and they rewrote all the Buddhist history. They gave Theravada Buddhism which means the teaching of the elders, a new name. And they call that Hinayana, which means lower teachings. And then they call what they got Mahayana, higher teachings. Now, you can see in the Gahara carvings, and this is about 150 AD into the AD, when they changed the image of the Buddha from black to white. Now, you see the image of the Buddha. He's looking like a Greek. He's got the straight hair. Now, you got to understand now that before Buddhism got to China, it didn't get to China until 1,000 years after the death of the Buddha, and Buddhism did not get to Japan until 1,400 years after the Buddha. Now, Buddhism was in Africa 1,000 years before it ever got to Japan. So when you talk to the Japanese people, when you talk to Asians, they treat us as if they're giving us Buddhism. However, when you look at the history of Buddhism, you will find that the Buddha was a man of African descent, and this is some of the oldest black history. Now, Nichiren Shonin writes in the Go Show, he writes that Brahmanism is distorted teachings of Buddhas who came before Shakyamuni Buddha. You see, the word Hindu, you cannot find the word Hindu in ancient writing texts. Dr. Wihimru and Becker discovered that the word Hindu did not even exist. See, these guys have created a fraud. See, when they created the fraud of the Sanskrit fraud, they got together and created what is known as the Vedic culture, or the Vedic teachings. The Vedic teachings, what they did was, they wrote that Sanskrit came 1,500 years before the Buddha, and they came up with what's called the Aryan invasion theory, and they made Sanskrit the oldest language. However, when you look at archaeological, anthropological, genetic science, literary science, we find that there was no such thing as an Aryan invasion. There was no such thing as this Vedic culture contemporary or even before or during the time of the Buddha. The Buddha came from Magadha, and Magadha came from the Harappan civilization. Now, let's move on to Japan. Now, regarding Japan, Japan is a Mahayana Buddhist country. And the Nichiren sects, that's the SGI, Nichiren Shoshu, and Nichiren Shu, all made an effort to remove black history, not only from Buddhism. The Nichiren sects removed all black history from Japan. Japan set up its own Buddhist platform. That means they established a platform to bring the Buddhist faith to the Japanese people. And it was Emperor Shomu in 752 AD where they created a platform. And the platform and the introduction of Buddhism in Japan was in the ancient capital of Nara. And the temple is called Toda-ji Temple. In Toda-ji Temple, you see the cosmic Buddha. What you see is the Black Buddha. This Black Buddha is the world's largest indoor Buddha statue. It is made of bronze and gold. It was created by the Japanese Emperor Shomu. And so you see undoubtedly some of the greatest and the absolute Buddhist history with black people in Japan. It's right there in living color. And that you got a Black Buddha at Toda-ji Temple. Now, this is black history that's untold. The Japanese don't want you to know about this. The Nichiren sects don't teach about this. Please understand that the Black Buddha is at Todaji Temple. Now, well, the Todaji Temple in Nara, Japan, this is a UNESCO or a United Nations educational, scientific, and cultural organization. In regards to Nichiren Buddhism, the language of Sanskrit was used to remove Black history. You see, when the Vedics or the Brahmins got together to rewrite history in Sanskrit, or they rewrote Buddhist history, they wrote the Buddha out. See, the way they got rid of the Buddha, or the Black Buddha, is to incorporate the Buddha into the Hindu pantheon, and they made the Buddha one of the gods of the Brahmin or the Hindu religion. This is what they do it. See, the fact is, Sanskrit is an artificial language invented by Panini at the time of King Kanishka, when King Kanishka organized his own Fourth Buddhist Council. Now, the original work of writings of Buddhism is in the Pali language. I want you to see an image of the Pali language. These Buddhist writings are 13 times larger than the Christian Bible. You see, please understand that it was Shakyamuni Buddha who first intoned Yoho Kyo. Now, please be clear that the Lotus Sutra was written in 406 AD. It was written by Kumajiva in Chinese, and it was not translated from Sanskrit. The oldest version and the most used version of the Lotus Sutra came from Kumajiva that was translated into Chinese, and Nichiren Shonin got a basic Hanzan on the writings of Kumajiva, the oldest writing of the Lotus Sutra. I also want you to see the Lotus Sutra. One of the ways that the Japanese can't cheat us about Sanskrit is that the Lotus Sutra was written in picture form. And when you look at the pictures of the Lotus Sutra, what you see is black people on the graphics. If you see the black faces, you can go to the ancient caves in China and you will see the black people. Whenever you see a Buddha image, you're going to always see the black hair on the Buddha. Now, the Nichiren sects teach that the word Mandela is a Sanskrit word. We know that Mandela is not a Sanskrit word because Mandela is in the Pali Canon. So is the word Namu. Nichiren got the word Namu from the word Namo, which means devotion, in the Pali language. So they do all these things to educate Black Buddhist history, culture, and language. Please be clear that it is not Mahayana Buddhism. Nichiren clearly rejected Mahayana Buddhism. The Japanese Nichiren sects use Mahayana Buddhism to remove black history. Please be clear that both Shakyamuni and Nichiren both rejected Mahayana Buddhism. Let us be clear. Daisaki Keita, Nichiren Shoshu, and Nichiren Shu, and all of the Japanese sects call themselves Mahayana Buddhists. The Nichiren sects all reject Black Buddhist history. They all teach about the racist Vedic culture in India, and they all never protest, or you've noticed they've never written anything or protest about the caste system because they themselves promote and support Brahmanism. One example is, 2 years ago I was thinking to join the Nichiren Shu sect, and I bought a book called The Introduction of the Lotus Sutra. And when I read the first page of the book, it's talked about some sacred Sanskrit. You see, they use Sanskrit, or when you hear the word Sanskrit, you know that it's used to educate your black culture, your black history and language. He writes in the quotes, though the Hinayana or lesser teachings differ from those of Mahayana or great vehicle, they are alike in both being the preachings of the Buddha. When the Buddha rejected Hinayana and replaced it with Mahayana, and when he in turn rejected Mahayana and introduced his followers to the Lotus Sutra, he was rejecting different things. The Hinayana in one case and the Mahayana in the other, but the aim was the same in both cases, namely to lead his followers to the Lotus Sutra, unquote. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the Buddha Shakyamuni rejected Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhism. So did Nichiren. Now, the Gosho, the sacred teachings of the Buddha's lifetime reads, quote, the voice carries out the work of the Buddha, and this is called Kyo or Sutra. I, Anthony F. Elmore, is using my voice to carry out the work of the Buddha. Dr. Martin Luther King dealt with the law of cause and effect. But Dr. King did not deal with the law of cause and effect, but he put it poetically. And I want to close my lecture with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. And this is how Dr. Martin Luther King put it. He said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards the elbow of justice. We are fighting for justice being the Black Buddhist voice. Our voice is the justice because we're fighting for the inclusion of our Black Buddhist history, culture, and language. I am Anthony L. Elmore, President and Founder of the Proud Black Buddhist World Association, bringing you a lecture called The Black Buddhist Voice in America.